everyone. Today we're going to talk about the moral issues of human experimentation. To start off, we'll be discussing the Nuremberg Code. So, what is the Nuremberg Code? The Nuremberg Code is a template set of rules for the conduct of human experiments articulated in 1947 in the trials of Nazi doctors and bureaucrats convicted of crimes against humanity for their roles in concentration camp experiments. So, the Nuremberg Code was developed because of the atrocities committed by the Nazi involving human experiments. These experiments left the human subjects physically and mentally traumatized and were often fatal. That is why the Nuremberg Code was created to avoid inhumane manners when experimenting on human beings. So, here are the 10 rules of the Nuremberg Code. The first one is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the subject has the right to proceed with the experiment or not. The human subject should not be coerced or deceived into agreeing with the experiment and should be informed about the process, duration, and methods that will be done. It is important to note here that it says voluntary consent of the human subject. It does not say that a parent or guardian can give consent for the individual. The subject themselves has the right to engage with the experiment or not, and their decision should be respected. Number 2, the experiment should be for the benefit of all. We should not abuse our power to experiment to fulfill our own personal interest. Number 3, this means that there must be studies first on animals before we test it on humans. This is to minimize any possible side effects or fatalities. Number 4, the experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. The subject's physical and mental health should be the priority. Number 5, if there is a high risk of the experiment failing and causing irreparable damage, the experiment should not be continued. Number 6, this means that the risks should not outweigh the benefits. Number 7, proper preparations should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death. Number 8, the experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. Number 9, it is the right of the volunteer to end the experimentation anytime. They can choose not to participate any further. Number 10, as the scientists, they should know better and end the experiment should the situation become dangerous. So, here are the justifications for human experimentation. Why is it necessary to conduct human experimentation? While human genes are 85% identical to mouse genes, it is never 100%. That is why experiments with humans will still yield more accurate and reliable results and solutions for human health problems than studies conducted on animals. In fact, the development of polio and smallpox vaccination, for example, as well as treatment of herpes, hepatitis, AIDS, TB, and many other medical advances in the call of public health are mainly attributed to the experimentation with human beings. Although animal testing still does help to give prior knowledge before testing on a human, and it often complements human experimentation. The purpose of human experimentation is not to help a specific patient, but to advance medical knowledge so that future patients who are suffering from the same ailment as the experimental subject may be healed.
Now, let us discuss about medical therapy and medical research. Medical therapy is designed and conducted for the benefit of the experimental subject, either to diagnose or treat an illness. Medical therapy aims to relieve the suffering of experimental subjects and bring them back to health. Those who perform medical therapy are called medical therapists. Their primary concern would be the well-being of their patients and how they can cure their diseases and other disorders so that they can have a quality life. On the other hand, medical research is an experiment not designed to benefit the experimental subject directly, but only to derive knowledge that can be utilized in the treatment of other persons with similar ailments. Medical research aims to study the experimental subject so that they can have a better understanding on how different processes in the human body works, and how certain treatments, medicine, or therapies can affect the human body in a positive or negative way. This is done to see which type of therapy is effective in curing diseases and other disorders. Unlike medical therapy, helping the patient get well is not the main goal of medical research. In some instances, a physician may be acting both as a researcher and a therapist. A physician becomes both a researcher and a therapist because while they are concerned with the patient's well-being, they also collect data which can be used when studying a disease. The concept of informed voluntary consent started in Nuremberg, where German physicians were charged with conducting human experimentation without the consent of the inmates. As a significant aftermath of such horrible experiments, the idea of informed consent was born. Informed voluntary consent. Consent must be given before an individual becomes an experimental subject is considered to be the basic requirement for medical research to be morally legitimate. Experimental subjects must be briefed and informed about the humane purpose, the procedure, possible inconvenience, pain, and risks of the experiment. This would help the experimental subject to know what they are getting into and how it might possibly negatively affect them in the future. The individual must be informed about what cause the procedure is for. An individual may decide to participate in research after being provided with background information pertinent to making a decision. They can also decide to withdraw from the procedure if they have doubts or are hesitant to continue. So, what is the importance of informed voluntary consent? Informed voluntary consent protects people whose autonomy is limited, such as children, mental patients, and prisoners, who might be vulnerable to persuasion, pressure, or manipulation and cannot speak or decide for themselves. The following are guidelines to informed voluntary consent. The first one is to explain the procedures and their purposes and clarify which among these are experimental. Next is to underscore the risks and discomforts that can be reasonably expected. This includes temporary or permanent side effects. Describe the possible benefits that the research will yield. Point out appropriate alternatives that might be helpful to the subject. There might be other procedures that have less complications or are more effective than that the subject can take instead if they are doubtful of the experiment they will undergo. Next is to offer to answer any questions about the procedures and make it clear to the subject that he or she is free without penalty to withdraw, consent, and abandon the research project at any time. An example of violations of informed voluntary consent are instances where vital organs like the brains, lungs, kidneys, heart, or liver are salvaged from a deceased person to be used for medical experiment and research. Such acts are a violation of the principle of informed voluntary consent. Consent from the nearest kin must first be acquired before conducting autopsy without any form of pressure or duress whatsoever.
Drug testing and the use of placebos. Drug testing refers to the medical procedures whereby a new drug is tried and experimented to determine its effectivity, usefulness, and other effects. The procedure is twofold, preclinical and clinical drug testing. So before, ang ginagamit nila is animals such as mice, frogs, rabbits, and monkeys. Pero ngayon, ang ginagamit na nila is humans. Preclinical drug testing, they use to determine drug therapeutic index by means of knowing if it is toxic or non-toxic, effective or ineffective, if it has effect on body tissue or particular organ, or if it has side effects and hazards to consider. Examples are carcinogenic or abortifacient. So, clinical drug testing, like what I've said earlier, humans are being used as experimental subject. It has 3 phases. The first phase is to determine whether it produces toxic effects. Via clinical trials, they use the new drugs to test to the healthy human volunteers. And then for second is, if result of first phase is acceptable, if it is effective. Kapag effective is they will administer or they will release it to a limited number of patients which might benefit from it. And then for third phase, if the drug produces a desirable result, if it has no serious side effects, then that's the time that they will release it to a larger number of patients. So, clinical drug testing is usually conducted in big public institution. And kapag naging successful yung trials, that's the time that it will proceed to licensing of the drug. So, to avoid biases or influences, a common procedure is followed in drug testing, which is the use of placebos. Placebo is medically harmless, ineffective substance such as sugar or dummy pill. So, to test the actual effectivity, it is used to test the actual drug's effectivity and to rule out any possible biases of patients and investigators. So, for example, is si patient A binigyan ng new vitamins which is for strong stamina, and then si patient B naman is binigyan ng sugar pill. So through that, the medical practitioners or the medical authorities will find out the new vitamins is maybe pharmacologically effective or it is just a psychological effects. So next is the single blind and double blind test. This is done to prevent any alterations of the results. So, sa madaling salita is single blind test is si participant lang yung blinded. While double blinded test design is both participant and the tester or experimenter are blinded because they are not supposed to know who we are receiving the drug or who are not.
So for my topic is all about the justification for the use of placebo. First, what is placebo? A placebo is used in clinical trials to test the effectiveness of treatments and is most often used in drug studies. For instance, people in one group get the actual drug while the others receive inactive drug or a placebo. So it means the use of placebo seems to legitimize it since the experimental patients who are giving placebo are deception. Next, there are two-fold justification, the paternalistic and the utilitarian. The paternalistic defense justified the use of placebo in clinical drug testing through its therapeutic effects on the experimental patient themselves. So it means that the experiment is beneficial, advantageous, and favorable to them. It is being carried out of their own good and for others who similarly situated. While the utilitarian defense considers a placebo experiment as acceptable insofar as they promise to benefit the whole of society in many instances, and not only the experimental subject. So in short, the utilitarian agrees the experiment using placebo are legitimate because the knowledge gained from them is socially valuable and beneficial. So also the needs of society at large for healthcare and survival justify a placebo experiment. So criticism, the type of moral injustice done to patient given placebo does not lie in the placebo itself, but in the manipulation and deception that accompany its prescription. So a placebo is an experiment deceptive in nature and deception. No matter what is proposed, is cannot to approve morally. Deceptive practices by their very nature tend to go beyond the normal refrains of accountability, thus having the tendency to spread more easily. So deceptive is permitting a widespread practice of deception, however, is one way of setting the stage for the abuses and growing mistrust. So what Augustine says about white lies may be caught in this context. Little by little and bit by bit, this will grow and by gradual accession will slowly increase until it becomes such a mass of big lies that it will be utterly impossible to find any means of resisting such a flood grown to huge proportions through a small addition. So because some people who do not discover the deception and are left believing that placebo remedy works may continue to rely under the wrong circumstances.
Our next topic is about research involving children, prisoners, the poor, and fetuses. Children's bodies are developing and growing systems in which their anatomy, metabolism, and biochemistry are different from those of adults. Thus, certain drugs are absorbed and metabolized faster in children than in adults. Sometimes these drugs produces different effects when administered in children. Moreover, their nutritional needs are different, and they are prone to certain kinds of diseases such as measles that are either less common in adults or occur in different forms. Even familiar surgical procedures cannot be employed on children because their developing organ systems are sufficiently different, so special pediatric techniques must often be devised. The practice resulted in blindness and impaired vision in a great number of cases, and a controlled study was conducted. The damage was traced to the effects of oxygen. If not for the research made, the practice of using oxygen would have continued and thousands more infants would have been blinded. Prisoners should be asked for their consent and should be informed of the risks and purposes of any study that involves them. Participation in the research must be voluntary, and duress or undue influence should be avoided as much as possible. If they volunteer, they should do so primarily for moral or humane reasons. Disadvantaged people who cannot afford hospital confinement may be asked to participate in medical research, inasmuch as they avail themselves of charity treatment for their ailments. They may just as well join and partake of a research project that would yield benefits to many people. Potential volunteers to become research subjects, however, should be informed and free in their decisions. Next is about fetal research, in which it is conducted on fetuses that are going to be aborted. The aim of fetal research is to determine by autopsy how much of a specific drug previously injected has entered into the fetal tissues. Such information is of prime importance insofar as it increases medical knowledge of how to provide treatment for a fetus still developing in its mother's womb. It also helps to determine ways in which drugs taken by a pregnant woman may affect a fetus, thus paving the way for improved prenatal care. Our last topic is about the application of ethical theories. Number one is utilitarianism, in which it endorses human experimentation in general insofar as there are specific cases in which the sacrifice of a few will bring great benefits to many. The principle of utility encourages healthcare professionals to design experiments that reduce sufferings and the risk of harm. Next is Kant's ethics. Under Kantian ethics, only rational and autonomous individuals who are able to understand experimental procedures, purposes, risks, and benefits, and are thereby capable of giving consent, may volunteer for experiments, if they expect the latter to be of therapeutic benefit. Next is the natural law ethics, in which its principle of double effect and totality gives a conditional justification for human experimentation. Experimenters have an obligation to supply experimental subjects with the information that they need in order to make a decision. If one decides to give his or her consent, it must be given freely and should not be the result of harassment or deception. Rawls' principles of justice, meanwhile, state that all experiments which are violative of individual liberty enjoyed by every person by virtue of being a member of society are forbidden. Medical research that employs deception is ruled out. Voluntary informed consent is a condition sine qua non for all experimental subjects. Research that takes advantage of the sick, the poor, prisoners, or the retarded and does not benefit them is morally objectionable.
But Mengele didn't just let new arrivals live so they could work in the labor camps. He wanted them for medical research. His SS file reveals him as a specialist in genetics and eugenics. Mengele shared Hitler's obsession with racial purity. His dream was to copy the blonde, blue-eyed model of Aryan perfection, exemplified by members of the Hitler Youth, and then develop the means to genetically manufacture it on a massive scale. At Auschwitz, Mengele was particularly fascinated by identical twins. Sharing the same genetic blueprint, twins allowed him a unique opportunity to experiment on one and compare the results with the other. Now Mengele was presented with as many twins as he wanted.
These are all identical twins used for medical experiment. Hundreds of twins from all over Europe were brought to this camp. They were numbered, but their origin and even their names are unknown.
One of them was Eva Moses, seen here a day after liberation. Eva remembers meeting Mengele after receiving several toxic injections into her arm.
Then Mengele declared, laughing sarcastically, he said, "Too bad. She's so young. She has only 2 weeks to live." I refuse to accept his verdict. I refuse to die.
In all, Mengele murdered 3,000 twins. Some after chemicals were injected directly into their eyeballs. His aim? To turn the color of eyes from inferior brown to Aryan blue.